Okay, we are live. So, hello and welcome back to This Week in Haiti, the third, it's technically
it's the fourth.
Yeah, the fourth episode, third live stream. Uh, and again on Sunday, first Sunday of October, October 5th. And again, I'm Joseph Mullen, joined with the English language editor of Haiti Liberté, Kim Ives. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you for spearheading this initiative to get us into the 21st century with a podcast.
My pleasure.
I can tell the téléspectateurs, as they would say in Creole, that this would probably not have happened without Joseph Mullen's insistence and expertise. Yes.
Appreciated. So this is a very kind of tragic week, I guess you could say. The paper for the week, the issue. We did the issue review on Wednesday, and that's been uploaded. So again, the telespectator can observe that issue review. Anybody watching can check that out. Maybe we can link it in the description or something.
And I would just like to say there was a slight, as this very occasionally happens, layout error where our artist, Fatlin Milani, put the wrong text for the page 8 article. So you will find the correct text if you have a printed copy of the paper on the flipping book on the website. The correct text is in there, and also, of course, in the URL version of the article of Catherine Charlemagne, which is about the Cour de Cassation, the Supreme Court of Haiti, being the new alternative for the future government.
Yeah. Otherwise, the edition is pretty tragic because of the so-called gang suppression force, more the imperialist intervention force. And really, I think you can't just say that it's just another this is really, as we said on Wednesday, the issue review on Wednesday, good to check out, because we kind of laid it out how different and how volatile this new intervention force will be. But we have again a copy of the paper, and as Kim just mentioned, it's online on the website until the new edition comes out, the new issue for next week, but you can get the flipping book. And I think before we get into the nitty gritty on what we're going to be kind of the main topic of the day, which is the pretext that was laid for this intervention force, and kind of the theme of this podcast for this live stream for today, the issue review Wednesday. There are other stories that I'm going to turn to later in the show, but we're going to begin. You also, Kim, posted the speech that you made at the outside of the UN building at the protest. So that protest was against the imperialist intervention force resolution that passed before day of, trying to prevent it from passing. And that protest led by Black Alliance for Peace. So Kim, can you talk a little bit about that protest and the intervention that you made?
Right. Well, we and Black Alliance for Peace, and I think all anti-imperialists and pro-sovereignty Haitians and their supporters were not aware of when the actual vote was going to take place. We thought, as we mentioned last week, that it would happen on Monday. As it happened on Tuesday. And so there was a last minute emergency demonstration called for Ralph Bunche Park at 2 p.m. by Black Alliance for Peace. I think I'm not sure what time the call went out, but when I looked at my Twitter or when I got actually a text message from one of the Black Alliance for Peace leaders at in the early morning hours, about 7 or 7:30. That's when I saw there was going to be a demonstration at 2. So basically, the demonstration had 6 hours to mobilize, which, as anybody knows, even in New York City, is not a lot of time to get people out. So it was about 12 to 14 to 15 people that turned out for that demonstration. I say that range because some people came for the beginning and others came afterwards. So probably a total of 16 by my count. But it was a spirited demo, I could say, mostly young people. There was only 2 other Haitians who showed up from my count again. And it was, I could say, hoping that there would be some miracle at the end. We had a notion from our diplomatic sources that it was unlikely there would be a veto of the vote. We had more or less a clue that things were not going to go in our favor. But in an effort to try to nudge particularly China and Russia to exercise their veto, and they were very well aware of the terrible motivations of Washington behind this measure, but they were essentially browbeaten by the U.S.'s vassals in the region, in the Organization of American States, OAS. Again, Cuba calls this Washington's Ministry of Colonial Affairs, and the CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Community, which by and large is the English-speaking Caribbean, which tends to be the most royalist, if I can say it, or faithful to following U.S. dictates, to no small measure because most of their economies are tourism-based, being in the Caribbean, and therefore totally reliant on Washington and the larger American tourist public for their bread and butter. And so they tend to be extremely amenable to Washington's lead. All of that, despite there being some sword flourishes, or as the Haitians would say, coup de pied dans l'eau, sword strikes into water, which they occasionally do. But these flourishes do not really represent any strong resistance to imperialist rule. If they were to do it, they would likely suffer the fate that Haiti is now facing, and that, of course, Grenada faced in 1983 when Maurice Bishop began to speak out and break away, and very quickly you found the island smashed under the boot of the Pentagon. Yeah. So with that said, that demonstration happened. It began at 2. The vote we knew was going to happen at 3. And indeed, we sort of said to each other at 3, okay, they're sitting down to vote. And at 3:07 or 8, they said, up, the vote came in and it was against us. So, or I should say against the Haitian people. So it was a vote basically where Russia and China, and also Pakistan, which was good to have at least a third country voted in favor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they abstained. I should say they abstained from the vote, which is a way of saying we don't agree. But if Russia or China had voted no, that would have been a de facto veto, and the force would not have gone forward. But the OAS and CARICOM were the ones they said in their statements, both China and Russia said they did it only because of the entreaties, of the requests, of the persistence of OAS and CARICOM. So that just goes to show that despite waning U.S. power, despite the U.S. attacking Venezuela's, or not even, well, they are attacking Venezuela, but blowing up random boats, now 4, as they cruise off the coast of Venezuela, often in international waters. This is the ultimate act of just piracy and complete imperial impunity. Just unbelievable to watch this. And, we belittle it, but this is 21 people now who have died at the hands of the U.S., just wielding this completely arbitrary and unjustifiable power to extinguish the lives of people who we don't know who they are. We don't even have the names. They don't publish the names, and no proof, nothing. They just blow these ships up out of the water. So despite this horrible display, these countries went along with their U.S. master and voted and pressured the Security Council to vote for this gang suppression force, which, it should be noted just while we're on that, Russia noted that this may well be used, this force, this which we're going to get into, this gang suppression force may well be used to find a way to bring attacks against Venezuela in this obviously escalating campaign.
Yeah, you're saying.
Yeah, the connections of gangs. Yeah. And I noted that last week, certain Eliobert, known as Eddie One, who was a drug trafficker, picked up 2 decades ago for drug trafficking, and he was indeed a drug trafficker, but they just arrested him again. And I won't be surprised if he ends up being one of the people they use to try to draw a connection with Venezuela, or now Colombia, now that Petro is on the blacklist, as it were.
Well, I want to, can you talk a little bit about two things, and this is going to segue or pivot us into the main kind of angle of analysis for today's show. One, can you talk about the mechanisms for funding of the GSF? Because we kind of have touched on that, but we haven't fully explicated how they're pulling the trust funds.
Right.
We haven't really dug in super deeply into that, and how the precedent kind of for that, of even having these interventions run through the United Nations of all bodies, kind of lies with Chapter 7.
Right.
That the mechanism for which you could use a UN, a global international body like the UN, could be set up for foreign intervention, really kind of kicked off with Korea and these foreign interventions. But we talked about Chapter 7 in our first episode. We kind of laid out how it came to be, that there are these different articles of the Constitution of the UN Charter. But yeah, let's talk about those two topics. One, how they're going to pull the funds, the mechanisms for funding these trust funds, and then the Chapter 7 that enables the whole shebang.
Well, without going into too much detail, or going into the weeds, as one might say, the UN is one of the few international bodies which, like NATO, has the power of organizing international armies to go carry out war. And as we talked before, basically since the 1990s, primarily since the 1990s, which began in the 1980s. I'll even say the late 70s. The U.S., after their gunboat diplomacy period, where they occupied Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Philippines, and other countries in the early 20th century. This is the 19 teens, the 14, 15, 16, under Teddy Roosevelt, under Woodrow Wilson. They installed tin horn dictators, they used to be called, caudillos, usually military or strongman dictators who would keep the peace and basically establish dictatorships that were very effective, very repressive, but also very corrupt. And this started to create all kinds of revolutionary movements. And eventually they saw by the 1960s and 70s, as Vietnam was raging and Central America was beginning to rise up, that they had to come with a new formula. And that formula became the UN peacekeeping force, where essentially...
I'm sorry to cut you off just quickly. I said that it kind of begins with Korea, which you can talk more about, but I should say as well that the Congo was another place where these peacekeeping forces intervened under the UN Blue Helmet program, and that is a whole, whole another can of worms of how that went.
Right, and that would be one to draw a good parallel. But so essentially the changeover came primarily during the administration of Jimmy Carter, which was kind of a shift away from what had existed previously. Again, people will recall that Richard Nixon resigned in ignominy in 1974. That was part of an inter-ruling class struggle. They kicked him out because of supposed corruption and malfeasance during Watergate. In any case, Jimmy Carter came in. He was very connected with the Trilateral Commission, was very much a part of the deep state. But their thing was to push the agenda of human rights. Human rights was for the first time really coming into the nomenclature of the world, and we saw his UN ambassador, Andrew Young, who went on to become a fairly prominent politician, but was always sort of part of the blackface emissaries of the deep state.
In South Africa as well.
In South Africa as well. So he was going around the world sort of lecturing the tin horn dictators who had previously been in their employ, and they began ousting them. Marcos and Duvalier in 1986, Pinochet a few years later. Of course, Somoza had been kicked out by the people in 79 in Nicaragua. So there began this changeover where they would do what Edward Herman coined as demonstration elections which were done just like here in the United States, where the candidate with the most money wins, and which are keeping the situation of the country within the confines of imperialist parameters. And if they get in trouble, then instead of resorting to the soldiers who are sent back to their garrisons to basically to play a background role, we send in the UN peacekeeping force. So Haiti really became the test case. Now, this was because, again, Chapter 7, I don't know, do we segue into Chapter 7 at this point? Or no?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So Chapter 7, again, for people and you can easily go to the UN website, just do UN Charter, and you'll see it right away. But Chapter 7 says the Security Council will have the authority, if they vote to do so, to deploy Chapter 7 to maintain international peace and security. And it must be stressed that this was to be used just for international conflicts between two countries, like, say, India and Pakistan, or between Greece and Turkey over the island of Cyprus, or there were a number of other cases, North and South Korea, presumably. We could say that was actually national, artificially divided, but North and South Korea, we see it, of course, in North and South, in South Sudan and Sudan. But they were not allowed, as I believe it's Article 8 or 9 or 10, which says they cannot go into the internal affairs of countries. They cannot be deployed for that. So this is quite explicit in the UN Charter. And so that is where the UN Charter has gradually been perverted, and this Chapter 7 force or prerogative of the Security Council, which again is dominated by the imperialist countries, US, England, France. They have the majority, 3. And then China and Russia are there, but they're the minority. They do have veto. Okay, they do have veto powers, but again, it's they use them very judiciously. I would say too prudently. But in any case, we can talk about that later. So at this point, we could get into how Chapter 7 has gradually been captured more and more by the US and perverted. But suffice it to say that the UN, and by the way, in Korea, the only reason that the UN was able to be used there was that during that period, the Soviet Union had withdrawn from the UN. Right. They had taken a year or two of hiatus because they saw that the UN was sort of a rigged US agency to maintain their hegemony. And I think maybe the Korean War convinced them to go back in, so at least they could wield their veto. So in any case, that's the history of the UN, its executive force, which is its main force, because the General Assembly, say what you will, even though you have certain times, like when the General Assembly all walked out on Netanyahu, which can be useful, but it's primarily a symbolic body. They can take resolutions and, have all the voices of the world state their opposition to various imperialist policies, but they have no teeth, they have no muscle to change anything until they get on the Security Council, which, again, just to review for the téléspectateur, is 5 permanent members: US, France, England, China, Russia, which they are always trying to expand. Why isn't India on there, or Germany, or Japan, or a number of other countries? But in long and short is right now it remains those 5 countries and then 10 others which rotate in for, I forget the term, I think it's 2 years or 3 or 1. But in any case, they come in and have a brief period where they can vote as well. But usually,
like Algeria is in there now. And,
you have Sierra Leone. You have a number of very small countries. Somalia, I believe, is in there right now. So it's a very useful to the imperialists to have these sort of window dressing other 10 nations there. Most of them are bought or bullied into voting however they vote. And it was interesting to see that Pakistan abstained. And that is, to me, to some extent due to the sort of questionable status of Pakistan right now, which is feeling the sting of the
Palestine.
On Palestine and on other issues too. Pakistan has been, since the ouster of Khan, a couple of years ago. Pakistan has been a little wobbly. Anyway, it was good to see that Pakistan also abstained. But anyway, long and short, and we're sort of segueing into it, is this latest vote. Essentially, the U.S. has replaced the Security Council with its own body, which will run Haiti, which is called the Standing Group of Partners, the SGP. So the Standing Group of Partners, we don't even know who it is, but it looks like it will be the countries who were involved in the MSS, the Multinational Security Support Mission, which basically was voted in October of 2023 and essentially came to an end on 3 days ago, on October 2nd, 2025, because it didn't have any financing to carry out its mission. It couldn't get tanks or troops or helicopters or whatever it was to the places where there were battles or trouble. So this goes to your original question, is explaining about the peacekeeping funds, these trust funds. And some people talk about the trust fund, but really the fund is a series of funds. And so to be part of the UN, you have certain financial obligations, which are determined by your GDP, et cetera, other factors. The US is, of course, the principal contributor to the UN, as it should be, since it's mostly serving its interests. But other countries are required or obligated to contribute to these trust funds, which then pay the budget of the peacekeeping operations, or whether it's in Congo or Sudan or India, Pakistan, or UNRWA in Pakistan, in Palestine and Israel, dealing with that conflict, etc. So these peacekeeping forces were funded by this, what they call the trust fund, but it is in fact a series of funds. The U.S. owes this trust fund $800 million, according to China's statement. And a lot of this can be found by going into the somewhat hidden pages of the UN's websites. And it's sometimes pretty hard to sort of make sense of all the different, tables and funds and requirements, etc. But the long story short is that the U.S. promised the Security Council, don't worry about money, we'll pay for the MSS. All we need is for you to say it's okay for them to go in to Haiti. And actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but the essence of this latest measure is to get a hold of those funds to pay for this force. So the U.S. doesn't have to do it. And we know that Trump is finding every way that he can, as our deficit balloons to over $37 trillion, to cut back on government spending and raise money, through tariffs or whatever it is, to find ways to get money elsewhere. And that's essentially what Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has done, is they said, okay, we're going to try to get a hold of this money. And it's being done through yet another UN office, which is established in this resolution, called the UN Support Office for Haiti. I think it's Support Office. Anyway, it's UNSOH, UNSOH, UN Support Office in Haiti, I believe is for Haiti. or for Haiti. So this office will be the one that essentially is somehow attached like a parasite to the UN Office of Peacekeeping Affairs, even though they took that out of the last one, because I won't say it's because of the Haiti Liberté article, but we pointed this out in our article of September 3rd, which people can find on the website or in the paper if you have it, where we pointed out that this is what they were trying to do with UNSO. Because the UN already has an office in Haiti called the UN Integrated Office in Haiti, BINUH, BINUH, which was there. But now they've created another one, which is basically complementary, but really overrides the BINUH, which was there as kind of a political commissar. And this one now is the office that they made to go in and siphon off the funds, supposedly for logistics. And as Dwight Eisenhower said, we cited in this past week's article, he said, most of warfare is decided by logistics. That is how you move your pieces around on the battlefield. You know, get your troops over here, this regiment there, get these tanks over here, get this bombs dropped over there. So logistics, moving troops and materiel is the key to warfare. With the actual shooting, yes, that of course plays a role, but according to Grok, or one of the chat GPT-like offshoots, 70% of warfare is decided by logistics. So, any case, be that as it may, I don't know if Grok was hallucinating or whoever, but in any case, the point being that logistics is the big ticket item in any intervention. And so now they've found a way to basically end run the UN Security Council, which is supposed to be in charge of that peacekeeping budget. And China and Russia, as you can see again also in this week, keep raising the question of, you've now got a very unclear, and it's not clear to anybody how they're going to suck it out, but they intend to suck it out. And as Russia said, you're making everybody pay for a promise that you made instead of you paying for it, US. And China said the same thing. You owe $800 million, $800 million to the peacekeeping budget, and you haven't even paid that. So anyway, we've arrived here through a kind of a long arc of 32 years. So we can now review that long arc if you think it is correct now to do so. Okay.
Certainly.
Okay, so really this all began back in the first coup against Aristide in 1991. Again, for the people who are not aware, Jean-Bertrand Aristide carried out the first, I could say, successful election of the pink tides that have now crashed across Latin America. And his began in 1990, on December 16th, 1990. Again, the formula for the demonstration elections we mentioned earlier was you pick your candidate, usually a UN or World Bank or International Monetary Fund expert, employee or official of some sort from the nation in question. And you pump in a lot of money to him and he wins the election. And that's what they did with a fellow called Marc Bazin in 1990. They finally got the election set up. And by the way, they tried to send in UN peacekeepers or UN troops to oversee this election, and Haiti sagely said no, and to a large extent due to the pressure and outcry of Ben Dupuy, who was at that time the director of Haiti Progrès newspaper, where I used to work. He was also my political mentor and sort of teacher. And so they rejected the UN troops, and the contest between Marc Vezin and a field of 13 others, or 11, I forget now, resulted in the victory from the last-minute entrant, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, former priest, liberation theologian priest, who came in at the 11th hour as the candidate of the FNCD, the National Front for Democratic. FNCD was the name of the coalition. And he won the election so convincingly that when they got to him having 67% of the vote out of this field of 11 or 13, I forget, was when they stopped counting, because they said nobody can catch up now. So basically, Marc Vezin, who did come in second, was decisively trounced. Jimmy Carter, in fact, went to the Aristide camp and said, listen, okay, you won, but Marc Vezin should be the one who comes in. And they basically had to tell him to go jump off a cliff. And so even Jimmy Carter, with all his credentials, couldn't intimidate them. And this was, in fact, a Palestinian Haitian called Antoine Ismarie, who would die 3 years later at the hands of Neo Duvalier's gunmen. That's another story we can come back to. But he was executed in a street outside of a church on September 11th, 1993. So the Aristide candidacy was brought in on February 7th, 1991, which February 7th has become the day of passage of power in Haiti since Jean-Claude Duvalier was driven from the country in 1986 on that date. So February 7th is the day when basically it's like January 20th, is it, in this country, where you have the passage of power. Okay, so in he came, and the U.S. immediately got to work, along with the Haitian bourgeoisie, in fomenting a coup against him. They carried out all sorts of mischief at the popular level, working with unions, working with groups, fomenting uprisings, creating fake demonstrations, doing everything. But finally, the army stepped in, and on September 30th, 1991, they came in and they ousted Aristide, who was saved. His life was saved only by the French ambassador, a guy called Raphael Dufour, who basically said, listen, you can't kill this guy. And they ended up sending him to Caracas, Venezuela, into the arms of Carlos Andres Perez, who basically solved the problem for the U.S. where to park this overthrown political leader. Just a little aside, there was a point in it where Hugo Chavez, who was basically inspired by Aristide, and said, oh, okay, so we can actually take power through elections and make changes. He was summoned by Carlos Andres Perez to a meeting, and at that time he was beginning to plan a coup against Carlos Andres Perez, a total U.S. vassal. And he thought that they maybe discovered the coup, and didn't know if he didn't go to the meeting, it would be an admission of guilt, but if he went, he might be arrested and who knows what. But when he went to the meeting, it was basically Carlos Andres Perez saying we have to provide some security for Aristide. So a little one of history's ironies. Anyway, back to the thread. The Aristide government was overthrown in that September 30th coup. And after that, there were basically 2 years of negotiations to get him back, because the U.S. basically said, after initially saying this coup will not stand, then Secretary of State James Baker went before the OAS and made a big speech. It will not stand. We are standing against it. But the very next weekend, they totally did a 180 and said, well, Aristide sort of brought it on himself. He was advocating mob rule and he deserved what he got, basically. So anyway, the negotiations went on for 2 years between Aristide, who by then had moved to Washington to make that his base of operations. Typical Aristide, go and try to work from within the power. And then the coup regime, which was headed by a guy called Raoul Cedras, was the front man, but kind of the power behind the scenes was a guy called Michel Francois, who was a very ruthless and bloody enforcer and killer of any demonstrators. So finally, it became clear that the only way that Aristide was going to get back was through some kind of armed force. Now, the question became, was this going to be a popular armed force, a guerrilla army, which is, again, what Ben Dupuy was more or less advising Aristide to do, or was it going to be through this UN peacekeeping force? And that's where I'll pick up.
Shall I read
Oh,
this?
yeah, you could read it. Yeah, then this is where, this is from Ben Dupuy's obituary, which more or less explains the lay of the land and how this first, I'll call it grave error, faux pas, some might say, but it was a really big mistake. So, Joseph Muller.
Dupuy was categorically opposed to the specter of U.S. foreign military intervention into Haiti, which from the coup's first days, before any other Haitian diplomat, he recognized as the likely endgame of negotiations with Washington and its vassal institutions acting as intermediaries, the Organization of American States and the United Nations. The Soviet Union had just crumbled, and Dupuy saw Washington's unipolar New World Order as a beast with no constraints nor scruples. His virtually one-man crusade to foil their interventionist push was epitomized by one early 1993 meeting in which UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali received Aristide at UN headquarters in New York. According to his account, Dupuy practically forced himself into the meeting, where he sat, uninvited, at the table amidst the other visibly uncomfortable diplomats and the ousted head of state, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. "What would you like us to do?" Boutros-Ghali placidly asked Aristide, according to Dupuy, who sat glaring across the table. Perhaps flustered by Dupuy's presence, Aristide beat around the bush, by Dupuy's account, and did not ask that day for the UN to place Haiti under its Chapter 7 powers, where the Security Council takes control of the country. However, Aristide did request Security Council intervention in a May 7, 1993 letter to Boutros-Ghali, and on June 16, 1993, the Security Council put Haiti under Chapter 7 with its Resolution 841, thereby signaling an invasion's inevitability. Like Dupuy, Cuba, in a June 14, 1993 letter to the Council, had argued strongly against the move, quote, opposing with the greatest energy the Security Council's adoption of measures concerning the internal situation of this country, Haiti, because it would create, quote, a dangerous precedent which is in line with several previous attempts to give this body powers and a mandate which are larger than those granted in the Charter, end quote. And continue, quote, by requesting the Security Council to take up the case of Haiti, Aristide has surrendered his leadership and control over efforts for his own restoration to an international body controlled by the very nation which had a hand in the coup which overthrew him, Dupuy wrote in a June 26 statement. The New York-based Haiti Commission of Inquiry into the September 30th coup d'etat, which was headed by Ben's close friend and ally Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General. Quote, having usurped control of the crisis in Haiti, the UN and the U.S. have begun forcing Aristide into a corner. In response, on June 23rd, 1993, Dupuy resigned as Haiti's ambassador at large with an open letter to Aristide that stated, quote, "Without pretending to be more patriotic than anyone else, I think that it is extremely dangerous to put the country's national sovereignty in the hands of an international organization whose real defense of the people's rights and even its impartiality can legitimately be put in doubt at this time." It's the end of his.
Yeah. So Ben, who was at that time the itinerant ambassador for Haiti, which is a kind of a almost honorific status because there's really no ambassador who doesn't have attachment to a country, but in a way it was sort of the gesture that Aristide made towards Ben and Haiti Progrès, which played a very large role in his political rise and even his election. So he felt compelled to more or less give Ben that role, but Ben used it to the utmost and had the prescience to see where this all was leading. So there we have the first two dots on the graph, the UN being formed in 1945 to basically cement in place the Pax Americana that succeeded the Second World War and have a Security Council which could stop fights between nations, international peace and security enforcer. And then fast forward, and we'll skip over Congo and Korea and a few of the others, but the UN is really starting to come into its new role in the early 1990s. And in a way, the Haiti coup is the first really big test of it. And this is where Aristide essentially gives the UN this, as Cuba said, this dangerous precedent of intervening in the internal affairs. This is a totally internal Haiti fight. But what the US and its vassals tried to do is say, well, it has international implication because there are refugees. And these refugees are somehow making it international because they go to the Dominican Republic or the Bahamas or to another nation, Jamaica maybe, or Mexico. And this is destabilizing, and this is blah, 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 blah. All baloney. This is not an international conflict. This is the results of an internal struggle, which is happening in Haiti. So the stage is set, unfortunately, by Aristide's terrible move of asking the United, and they needed somebody like Aristide who had just gargantuan prestige, not just in Haiti, but around the world. Here was the liberation theologian priest. He was the poster boy for righteousness and correctness and goodness and against evil, against the big, bad, mean generals and soldiers and imperialists who were attacking Haiti. So only Aristide could really make this request. And of course, it was justified by the various agents, I could say, of imperialism in his team. People like Fritz Longchamp, who was then, I believe, the foreign minister. Oh, no, that was Sabala. It was Sabala. There was another fellow who was the kind of chef de file, their leader, and his name was Jean Casimir. Anyway, Ben was doing great battle with those three who were very much pushing, as Jean Casimir said in the 1991 speech, we just have to find the correct levers of power. It was a technical issue of finding how to work the bureaucracy to our advantage. So they had succeeded in basically getting Aristide to put himself in the hands of the US. And that way, a few months later, on in September 1994, I think it was September 19th, US troops, 20,000, invaded Haiti and came in and pushed out the Cedras group and brought Aristide back, but brought him back in a cage.
Yeah.
Literally, he was on the stage of the palace in a big glass box, supposedly to protect him. But it was also, in a way, symbolically the box that he had to exist in, like an animal in a zoo. And he was expected to, follow the U.S. dictates, which were essentially to carry out neoliberal reforms in Haiti. Having gotten him to do the Security Council invitation, now he was to carry out the neoliberal reforms, which essentially consisted of privatizing 9 state industries. This included the cement factory, telephone company, the essential oils company,
Water?
the water, I don't recall, but I would not be surprised if water was in there. The telephone company, of course, was a big one, Teleco. Anyway, it was 9 of them, and which had been all sort of cash cows for the Duvalier dictatorship, and now they didn't want this to go to a anti-imperialist, revolutionary, or progressive government, nationalist government. So the whole push was to privatize it. And essentially, this goes back to capitalism's need to constantly, like a shark, be eating, because essentially at that time, the wars between the capitalist powers had been settled. It was no longer a question of, fighting for colonies and markets, as had been the case for the First and Second World War, but the councils at the IMF and World Bank and et cetera, looked at the world and they said, "Wow, 1/4 of U.S. 1/4 of the industries and enterprises in the world are publicly owned. Let's go get those." Yeah. And so that's when under Reagan and Carter, the push began for privatization. That's when you first started to hear this refrain of privatization. So Haiti, again, was a test case of this. But Aristide, what he did when he came in after agreeing to it, and a guy called Leslie Voltaire, who was part of the current temporary presidential council, or CPT, in Haiti, who runs Haiti. He was one of the Lavalas family representative on this. He went to a meeting in Paris and said, yes, we'll do everything you say in terms of doing neoliberal reforms. We'll privatize, we'll slash the state payrolls, we'll do all the measures you want for what they call structural adjustment. And actually, when Aristide would say, "Hey, but you signed this accord in Paris," and he said, "I didn't sign it." He did this typical Aristide. I didn't sign it. That was right. Leslie Voltaire. You pass it off. So anyway, long story short, he dragged his feet. He did what's called in Haiti marronage. Marronage means you kind of slow walk stuff. This dates back to the period of slavery, when slaves couldn't openly rebel against their masters without being beheaded. But, when the master would say, "Go, fetch me a cup of coffee," you kind of slow walk it. You walk, they say, "Step towards me," and you kind of step slightly diagonally off. So it's kind of a passive resistance. So marronage means that Aristide sort of slow walked when they said you got to do privatization. He called it democratization. And he didn't really carry it out with the speed and alacrity that they wanted. And they ended up basically pushing him out of power. A lot of people, there was a movement at the time saying he should reclaim the 3 years he'd spent in exile. That was basically quashed, and they put in a guy called René Préval, who was more ready to agree. He was the guy who actually privatized the minoterie, the flour mill, the cement factory, the telephone companies, etc. Okay, so essentially, Aristide has set the stage for this, but he comes back in the year 2000, and Preval, who is some sort of erstwhile ally of Aristide. They had a lot of problems between them and bitter disagreements, but they were more or less friendly. Preval had been part of Aristide's original sort of group that brought him to power. Preval allows Aristide's re-election in 2000, and the U.S. immediately gets about setting up another coup, but not one that's organized in the space of 8 months. They took 3 years to really do this right, and they got him out on February 29th, 2004. Okay, and now it was the time the door had been opened for the Chapter 7. So all they had to do, even though Haiti had stopped being under Chapter 7 in 2000, it had stopped. It was now under Chapter 6, which is where the UN acts as an advisor. They come in an advisory capacity. But in 2004, it was reestablished easily because now, any Haitian could step up, and I forget how exactly it was done, but they immediately put Haiti back under Chapter 7. And in came U.S., Canadian, and French troops. They took over the country from March 1st, 2004 to, I think it was June 1st. And at that point, they brought in the MINUSTAH, what was called the UN Mission for the Stabilization of Haiti. Now, MINUSTAH was really the next stage.
Chilean as well?
Say it again?
Chilean?
Yeah, Chile was involved in that. I mean, the Chileans sent troops, but it was primarily Brazil was leading it. And how did they get Lula to agree to send in Brazilian troops? Well, first, the reason they wanted Brazilians was because Haitians all see the Brazilian soccer team as sort of their soccer team, because Haiti's hasn't performed that well in World Cups and so forth. But Brazil, of course, is the champion of champions, and so that was one reason. 2, largely black country. But 3, they promised Lula, listen, maybe we got a permanent seat on the Security Council for you, where you would have veto powers and so on and so forth. But you got to really show your chops by carrying out a good, peacekeeping mission. And so he agreed to it, naive, to be as charitable as we can, as naive as that was on Lula's part. So
and Haiti's kind of the sacrificial lamb. Very often it gets kind of put on the chopping block for
right. It's the laboratory. I mean, Aristide used to use that term, the laboratory. It's where, in 1915 they first tested aerial bombing and strategic hamlets and all the counterinsurgency techniques that have become sort of, I'll say, part of the U.S. imperial playbook. Okay, so now MINUSTAH is really shows that Haiti is once again easily put under Chapter 7 because Aristide sort of opened the door in 93. So there we are, 11 years later.
Opened a Pandora's box.
So 11 years later, here they're now using Aristide's request against him to put in a force which will enforce this overthrow of Aristide. And MINUSTAH did terrible crimes. It's quite legion. People can read about it in Haiti Liberté. We used all the WikiLeaks documents, which were given to us by WikiLeaks in 2011, to really show just how terribly, terribly cynical and brutal and destructive to Haiti the MINUSTAH was. So now, here we are, 20 years later, and the world has radically changed because Russia and China are no longer cowed by the US. They're no longer waiting for their moment. They have begun their bid to change the world into a multipolar world from a unipolar world. And I don't need to belabor this part, but we already know that in the Security Council, the UN has become practically hobbled, has become practically useless. We've seen in Gaza, Israel, they can't get any votes through because the US just vetoes it. And on the other hand, the US knows that it cannot easily get through its resolutions to use the UN Security Council as their handmaiden in Haiti. And this became clear with what we call the Multinational Security Support Mission in October 2023, which was given authorization. It was the US could not just have the Security Council go in under Chapter 7 and take the Security Council and take the UN peacekeeping forces, what they call a UN peacekeeping operation, UNPKO. They couldn't just set up another UNPKO like MINUSTA the same way they did in 2004, because Russia and China said, no, we're not having that. So they set up a thing called this MSS, Multinational Security Support Mission, which was supposed to go help the Haitian cops fight the armed neighborhood committees, what are called gangs by the mainstream press and ultra left, to support them. And they found finally, after searching, after asking Brazil, after asking Canada, after asking other countries, they finally found Kenya as a willing partner, or shall we say, employee. And so the Kenyans force, the MSS, was supposed to be 2,500 troops. They only got to 1,000. But the reason was because they couldn't get it as a UN PKO. The US said, okay, this was under Biden, of course, under Blinken and Biden. They said, okay, all we need from the UN Security Council is authorization. We just need your blessing. We just need your benediction to send in this force. We don't have to be a UN force, a genuine UN PKO. We'll do our own force, but you say it's okay. And Russia and China said, okay. And it should be said that Haiti Liberté was asked to make a presentation on December 21st, 2022, before the Security Council. People can see that on our YouTube channel or on the website. And we explained that this is just one more case of a foreign international invasion, which will be killing Haiti, when in fact it is making its own history. It is self-determination that it's carrying out, that it does not need more troops coming in and, basically hurting the victims of who they're claimed to be helping. Okay. So the MSS ended up being set up, and Washington said, don't worry, we're going to pay for it, as I said earlier. And they said, okay. And Russia and China, following the statement that Haiti Liberté made, said, we appreciate Haiti Liberté's analysis and we agree, and this is something. But the UN representative of the U.S. representative at the UN said, this is a new way of guaranteeing international peace and security. So they thought they'd really pulled off a good coup. But they couldn't actually support it because the logistics and the cost of carrying out this mission was too expensive for them. They didn't have the money or the will because the empire is overextended. You have the war in Israel, Gaza, which basically exploded at the very time, 5 days after this vote was taken on October 2nd, 2023.
In like 2 days.
It was essentially taken on October 2nd. The vote happened authorizing the MSS on October 2nd, and October 7th was the Hamas operation against Israel, against the occupation of their country. So, of Gaza and the West Bank and so on and so forth. Okay, so now the U.S. had a war in Ukraine. They had a war in Gaza. And they had fights, of course, in ancillary cases in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, etc., going on, not to mention what's going on around Taiwan, etc. So the empire is really groaning under the weight of its various operations of maintaining and guarding the empire, preserving the empire. So Haiti became a kind of we could say, secondary question, and they thought that they could carry it, but clearly they couldn't. So that is where now Trump comes in, and we get to the third phase where Marco Rubio says, okay, we got to find a way. And they were pushing. They were putting a lot of pressure on Antonio Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, to basically pressure to have this become a UN peacekeeping operation. But Russia and China, they knew this wasn't going to happen. So they said, okay, we're going to find another end run around this and find a way through creating this UN support office for Haiti to get into the peacekeeping funds. And they're not going to basically pay the salaries of the troops, but they are going to pay for all the logistics, and even the salaries, it's unclear. And again, people can read the September 3rd article we wrote on this, because they do say that countries will be reimbursed for the supply and use of lethal weaponry, of lethal equipment, etc., which means that when they send a tank or send armored cars or jets or helicopters or whatever, mortars, they can be reimbursed. So it's another way of the UN paying for it. So basically, all the logistics and weaponry are basically being covered. And this is, as I said earlier, about 70% of the costs will be covered by the UN. So now Trump and Rubio have found a way to use this new way of preserving international peace and security that Biden pioneered, and finding the UN to get it, to pay for it. Basically, shifting the burden off the U.S. and passing it on to the world, onto the international community, and that's how Russia and China both put it in their, quote unquote, put it in their statements of disagreement and warning at the September 30th meeting that we just talked about. So, in essence, it is this force, which is again called the Gang Suppression Force, GSF, is functioning under Chapter 7, but it is not the UN Security Council which is running it, which is deciding how it's going to function. It is a new group called the Standing Group of Partners, which will basically be composed of Kenya, the US, Salvador, Guatemala, Belize, Bahamas, anyway, and Canada, groups and countries that were involved in the MSS are being recycled to be part of this, what's called the Standing Group of Partners, which the US, after the coup against Aristide in 2004, they set up a thing called the Core Group, which was essentially a group of its allied countries, England, Spain, Brazil, the European Union, etc., who took part in this group, this core group, which oversaw and decided who was going to be in charge of Haiti. For instance, as an example, after the assassination, which has the US fingerprints all over it, of Jovenel Moise on July 7th, 2021. There was a question of who was going to be the prime minister, that is the executive power of Haiti. And there were two guys fighting for the post. One was the guy who had been the interim prime minister, a guy called Claude Joseph. And then there was the guy who had been selected and was going to be inaugurated on July 7th, but he never actually got inaugurated, called Ariel Henry. So the two of them both laid claim to the prime ministership, but finally it was the core group, a totally foreign external power that said, no, it's going to be Ariel Henry who's going to run it. And Claude Joseph was shown the door. So all of this to show that this arc, that these things, and to some extent, the imperialists, they plan their things decades in advance. But it's this relentless incremental grabbing of power and just moving to keep control, hegemony of the planet, of its agencies like the UN, to carry out its imperial designs. And so Haiti, as we can see, has played a pivotal role. It has been the laboratory, as you were saying before, Joseph. It has been really the test case that they've been using to carry out these changes. So that is hopefully the lesson of the chapter 7. Can we call it evolution? From going from something that was going to stop the fights between countries in 1945 to 80 years later being something which the United States has arrogated for itself by placing those powers in the hands of its own appointed group called the Standing Group of Partners. And so the UN Security Council has effectively been sidelined. And even though they say the UN Security Council will follow and make all kinds of guidance and recommendation, and theoretically we'll see next year, it's got a 1-year mandate. We'll see if next year maybe China and Russia will veto this. Because just to close, I fear with Gaza as a guide, that these troops, this gang suppression force, is going to go into Haiti and raise neighborhoods the same way they have raised Gaza. They're going to raise the neighborhoods where the armed neighborhood groups have established themselves, and they are basically going to carry out a scorched earth policy. And I think we are entering a stage which will make or break this resistance, such as it is, to imperial control and capitalist, what can I call, strangling of Haiti and its people, where the people finally, who have found a way to find arms, are armed and fighting against the power. And there's a reason why the US State Department calls the Vivant Ensemble, the groups, these armed neighborhood groups, terrorists. It's so that they can come in and do just as they're doing off the coast of Venezuela, indiscriminately bomb whoever because they're terrorists. We've designated them terrorists, hence, ergo, they are terrorists, when it's a completely baloney word that they're just throwing out there, as we can see in the case of al-Jolani, now al-Shara of Syria, who was in February of last year a terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head, and today is the president, feted and praised and honored by the same U.S. government that was chasing it and putting that bounty on its head only 8 months ago. So
quite a turnaround.
Yeah.
Well, on the note of resistance and kind of shifting into that a little bit, we had an article in this week's paper, which I think is um, a good follow up to what we're talking about. We had this article here by Marie Laurette Numa on the Gen Z movement,
Right.
and I think this would be a good follow up to that last part you were saying about, this is all the history here of the uh, banding around of the term, who are the terrorists, even though it's pretty clear that the ones actually bringing the terror and kind of having the power to uh, enact terror on Haiti is the imperialists. Yeah. So this article on is there a Gen Z movement? I guess my question is kind of, and we're kind of in the second half, I guess, of the episode, but I guess that can be the question. Is there a Gen Z movement in Haiti? Is there one in the United States? Is there a global one?
Yeah. Well, I think, this really speaks to what is social media and what is our current world right now. It's very interesting. I recently was watching a podcast, which my colleague in making Another Vision, our film on Jimmy Cherizier and the movement of Haiti's poor. People, again, can find that on either the Haiti Liberté website or the Haiti Liberté YouTube channel. He was doing an interview with Twih. Dan Cohen was doing an interview, and his channel is called Uncaptured Media. So you can find it on his channel. But what they were discussing was the role of social media as a kind of a psyop, psychological operation of the ruling class, because we have to think all these social media platforms, including TikTok now, of course, which was in many ways the most popular, are being captured or are owned and controlled by the algorithms, by the money, by the power of billionaires, tech billionaires, who are totally in bed and working with and for the CIA and the US government, and are completely devoted to preserving their power in that empire. So in many ways, I think what's happened is we've had a generation, and you can speak to this and know this well, Joseph, because
I don't even know if I'm Gen Z.
I don't know what you are. And I thought it was interesting that, there's no other letters after Z, so, well, I heard now they have Gen AA or Gen A, but anyway, whatever. The point being that since the real emergence of social media, I could say at about 20 years ago, in 2005, 6, 7, above all, when the iPhone came out in 2007, was when it really just metastasized. It's begun to replace what we used to have, which were giant demonstrations. You would mobilize, people go out in the street, and you wanted to know what people thought and what they were doing. You would look at the size of the demonstrations, and that became the whole measure of how successful a demonstration was. How many people did you bring out? How many people came out? And we saw that at the beginning of the first Iraq War in 2003. There were, in fact, even dueling demonstrations between different coalitions, the Answer Coalition and the Justice and Peace Coalition here in New York, both based here in New York, or well, not both based here, but anyway, they were having demonstrations on alternate weekends in Washington, and this one had 100,000, this one had 105,000, that one had 110,000. So it became a whole thing of how many people you got out to the demo. That's no longer, I mean, it is to some extent the case, especially now with that we just see the world turning to demonstrations again because they're just so enraged with watching this live stream genocide in Gaza. But so many of the new generation and even the old generations have been sort of lulled, and I could almost say disabled by social media because they feel that they can make a difference by putting out a tweet or a bunch of tweets. And maybe the tweets are pretty good and maybe they have some interesting information, but it ends there. It ends up being just a, a gesture. And going back to this podcast I was talking about, Jay Twih, who is a brilliant biologist who in many ways was in the forefront of analyzing the whole COVID psychological operation that happened. He is a very brilliant, one of the most, he's the guru, I could say, of the biologists who are trying to understand what COVID is and was and how it came about. And basically, to cut to the chase on that one, it was not that this was some kind of lab leak at all, but this was, in fact, there was no pandemic in the traditional sense. This was something that was planted around the world by his vision because of his analysis of the strains of the COVID virus, which could not have appeared in the way they were supposed to have appeared. That is, they are too changeable to have occurred in the exact same form in New York and in Italy and in Seattle and in where the outbreaks happened around the planet and in China. So anyway, long story short, he railed against social media and saying this is very pernicious and it has destroyed and completely neutered the power of the people. And he said it's a little bit, I thought this was a good little anecdote. He said it's a little bit like watching the Dukes of Hazzard on your television and thinking that when they capture the bad guy, somehow that's going to affect crime in your neighborhood. You know, that is, this completely artificial reality is somehow going to translate into reality. So in many ways, this article that Marie-Laurette Numa did is speaking to that, because there was supposed to be a revolution 4 days ago on October 1st, brought about by this Gen Z social movement. They were all out talking against the power of various forces. There's no coherence, there's no guiding force or leadership or structure or organization guiding this, but it's simply an outlet for this generation to let off its steam, to put out its brilliant ideas, to talk to itself, to whip themselves up into a lather, all in the comfort of their basement apartment or in whatever way, but it's all just happening online in these little cages, in these little worlds, which are completely run by Elon Musk or whoever. Now by Ellison is the guy running now TikTok. I mean, it's been put in his hands, and they're keeping track of you. They know exactly what you think and how you think it, and they're gathering data on you, and they are keeping you off the street and out of mischief, because you are spending all your time devising your next tweet and your next Instagram post and your next WhatsApp group that you're going to make. So all of this to say that, yes, I think that article even though it more poses it as questions, puts its finger on the problem of today. And that's the difference, just to conclude, with the Vive Ensemble movement that we see in Haiti today, because these guys, yeah, they'll use social media. In fact, they do a lot of their political meetings online on TikTok and on WhatsApp and on YouTube and on live streams like
That's
this
true.
one. Not that we can't use it, but we don't end here. They are enforcing it in the streets
Yeah.
with arms. They are ready and they're building their organization. And granted, some people say this isn't a revolution because there's no party and there's no guy. No, the point is they have a revolutionary, at least Jimmy Cherizier, who is officially their leader, has a revolutionary agenda. He wants to change the system in Haiti. Now we could say, is it going to be a socialist revolution, to be a real revolution? But he is talking about taking ownership of the means of production, of the factories, of the land, of the ports, of the infrastructure of Haiti. So that's what's real. That's what's real. And that's why the U.S. designates it as terrorist. That's why the U.S. is going after them with hammer and tongs with this gang suppression force.
Well, I had one more question about another article in the paper, kind of looking again at the other highlighted pieces, and kind of we had our main piece, the big news of the week, but the other one that really struck my interest was the Ernesto Che Guevara in Palestine.
Right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
did you get a chance to read?
I did. I had a
Yeah.
chance to read it, and again, that's, I could say, the talent, or I could even say gift, that Bethany Dupont has, is each week to go through all the voluminous news of the world and select kind of the key articles that really are, to curate the giant mass of information out there. And so this article basically talks about how Che, who of course became an icon of international solidarity, of revolution, with the absolutely epic making 1959 Cuban Revolution, how he inspired the people around the world. And by the way, we are now just passing the anniversary of his death. I believe it's the 60th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken.
What day is it?
Is it October 5th? Is it today? Anyway, it's right in this period, and it may be in that article. I may have seen it there or elsewhere. But the point being that Che was a symbol who inspired people. And when he went to Palestine in 1959, this was right after the revolution came to power in January 1st of, much like the Haitian Revolution, which was also January 1st, or the promulgation of it. So 6 months later, I think in that article, it was June, or was it July of 1959, he was off visiting the Palestinians and essentially saying, you need to fight against what's happened to you. So here again, talk about prescience. Here was a guy who saw the importance of the Palestinian struggle a mere 11 years after the formation of the state of Israel. But he saw exactly what was happening and met with Nasser, then the leader of what was, in a way, we could say the precursor of the BRICS, what became the non-aligned movement. There was a meeting in Bandung, which was really the first steps towards the non-aligned movement, which later really became the BRICS. I mean, non-aligned because they were saying we're neither capitalist or communist. We're neither with the Soviet Union or the U.S., but we're nationalists. Anyway, today, of course, that movement is represented by the BRICS and by the multipolar world, which is emerging under the guidance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I think that Che's role there was one of the reasons why they saw it as so essential to extinguish him, and why the CIA, when he did go to Bolivia, trying to foment revolution there, it may well have been a mistake what he did. He didn't listen to the Communist Party of Bolivia, who said that what you're doing is ill-advised. He may have somehow been intoxicated by his own charisma and power to inspire, but it was not enough to overcome the forces that he faced in Bolivia. And of course, they captured him and assassinated him. In any case, I thought that was an amazing article. But again, and that's the key thing about a newspaper, is you are essentially seeing our algorithm. We are responding to the, I could say, billionaires' algorithms, which will lead you to articles which will take you elsewhere, or put you in some kind of corner. I'm not saying that they're for people to totally swear off social media and not use things like podcasts that we have here, and share this, etc. Yes, there's something to be done, but it's not a replacement for actually getting engaged, doing like Joseph Mullen here is an example of, who, he came here, he offered his services, he volunteered. We need people like that who are ready to put their time and their energy to the service of the struggle of groups which are trying to bring social change. So a tweet is not enough. An Instagram post, a Facebook post, a WhatsApp group is not enough. Just frothing at it, you have to put your shoulder to the yoke to make change happen.
Yeah. And socialism is social, but not social media is not
right. Social media is not socialism. I like that slogan. Good coining. Yes.
Well, we're up on an hour 30. That's our usual time. Any final comments you want to make for this week?
Final comments? Well, yeah, I think we have to really keep an eye on Haiti. Let's. They won a battle, but hopefully not the war. We'll see how this gang suppression force progresses. If they can get the troops, and if there is not resistance within the UN itself, if Russia and China can find some way to challenge the pilfering of UN peacekeeping funds to this effort. But I think they are also hugely underestimating the Haitian people, because these armed neighborhood groups, they are gaining consciousness, they're gaining strength. And yes, you can go and drop a bomb and wipe out a neighborhood, as they've done, as Israel, as the proxy of the US has done in the Gaza Strip. But Haiti is a big country, and I think the same way in the Chinese Revolution, when the communists were crushed in many ways in 1927, they adapted.
Yep.
And they moved to the countryside, and they did a long march. They marched 6,000 miles to the northwest of the country, and they started up again. I think the Haitians need to take lessons and inspiration from previous revolutions, which have been very successful. And again, when you look at the sacrifice and the hardship and the trials that both the Chinese and I could say the Soviet revolutions went through, the Second World War was fought and won by the Soviet Union. You really see how these nations, which are now offering amazing examples of what is possible for humanity, you see what kind of trials they went through to get to this point. So, Haiti, you're in the midst of a trial now, and we'll do everything we can to support you, but be aware that the future may be very bright when you are freed from those forces which today have a boot on your neck.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you for those in the audience who joined us, and we'll see you next weekend on Sunday again for another episode of This Week in Haiti.